At 11:03 a.m. on September 19, 1944, Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson huddled inside the turret of an M4 Sherman tank near Erasure, France, watching his gunner, Sergeant William Crawford, ready himself for a fight that felt like a death sentence. At 24 years old, Thompson had logged 4 months of combat in 12 tank battles, and in every single one, Crawford had never been the first to spot the enemy. Now 47 German Panther tanks were closing in, their superior firepower and optics a deadly threat to the outmatched Shermans. Since June, Thompson had served as Crawford's loader, feeding 75mm rounds into the tank's main gun. Their only chance of survival was simple: spot the German tanks before the Germans spotted them. But the Sherman's gunner sight was a fatal flaw, offering a mere 30-degree field of view. By the time the tank commander shouted a target and Crawford swiveled the turret into position, German gunners were already lining up their shots. Over 3 weeks, the 4th Armored Division had lost 23 Shermans to this deadly delay. Thompson had already watched 2 fellow loaders die, both killed because their gunners couldn't see flanking Panthers in time. The first was Corporal David Kozlowski, a Chicago steel mill worker who trained with Thompson at Fort Knox. On September 7th, a Panther hidden in a tree line picked off Kozlowski's Sherman from 1,300 yards. The shell pierced the turret, igniting the propellant charges as Kozlowski was mid-load. He died instantly, his body trapped in the burning tank for 3 hours. The second loss was even more devastating. Corporal James Martinez, Thompson's closest friend, who'd survived the Normandy landings by his side. They dreamed of opening a garage together back home once the war ended. On September 16th, near Beeson Light, Martinez's Sherman took out one Panther before a second flanked them, firing from 900 yards. The shell tore through the turret's side and struck Martinez directly as he pulled a fresh round. He was killed on impact. 2 days later, Martinez's tank commander sought out Thompson, tears streaming down his face, and said that 3 more seconds of warning would have saved Martinez's life. By mid-September, Thompson had witnessed 11 loaders perish, all because German tanks had better optics, all because American gunners couldn't see threats fast enough. The Sherman's 75mm gun could take down a Panther. That much Thompson knew. The problem wasn't the weapon, it was seeing the target first. Crawford was a skilled gunner, but 30 degrees of visibility was a death sentence. Every second wasted meant the difference between loading another round and burning alive like Martinez. Thompson knew he had to find a way to give Crawford more eyes, ways to spot threats instantly without waiting for the commander's call. The solution came on September 18th, and it was absurdly simple: a 3x4-inch mirror from his standard issue shaving kit. Mounted inside the turret, and Crawford could keep his eye on the main sight while glancing at the mirror to watch their rear and flanks, seeing everything the tank commander saw without turning the turret. There was just one catch: modifying military equipment without authorization was a court-martial offense, punishable by rank reduction or even prison. But Martinez was dead. Kozlowski was dead. 11 loaders were dead. Thompson wasn't about to become the 12th. He would install the mirror that night, test it tomorrow, and pray it gave them the split-second edge they needed to survive. If this story has hooked you, hit the like button now. It tells YouTube to share this tale of forgotten valor with more history lovers like you. Subscribe too so you don't miss what happens next. These stories matter. The men who lived them deserve to be remembered, and you're part of making that happen. That night, the maintenance area fell silent after 10 p.m. Most crews were asleep, leaving only the distant hum of generators and the buzz of insects under the overhead lights. The air reeked of engine oil, and the cool September nights in Lorraine made Thompson's breath fog in the dark. He retrieved his tool bag from under his bunk, pulling out the metal frame shaving mirror, wire cutters, pliers, salvaged steel wire, and a flashlight with a fading battery. His Sherman sat 50 yards away in the maintenance line. Thompson tramped over, his boots crunching on gravel, unchallenged. Nighttime maintenance checks were common, and no one would question a crewman tending to his own tank. He pried open the loader's hatch and climbed inside, the turret feeling cramped and claustrophobic. The flashlight beam bounced off metal surfaces, ammunition racks, the gun's breech, the seat where Crawford would sit at dawn. Thompson's hands shook as he held the mirror up to test different positions. Not from the cold, but from the fear of getting caught. The mirror had to be placed perfectly. Too high, and Crawford wouldn't see it while aiming. Too low, and it would block his movements. He settled on a spot 12 inches to the left of Crawford's seat, angled at 45 degrees, so it would reflect the view directly behind the tank. Any panther creeping up their flanks or rear would show up in the mirror. A 3-second check that could mean the difference between life and death. Thompson cut 4 6-inch lengths of steel wire, bending each into a U shape to use as mounting brackets. He drilled holes into the turret wall with a hand drill, wincing at the high-pitched squeal of the bit against armor plate. Every few seconds he froze, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps, but the night stayed quiet. The installation took 40 minutes. His fingers slipped repeatedly, the flashlight rolled away twice, and he dropped his pliers more than once, each clatter sending his heart racing. If an officer caught him, he'd face charges of destruction of government property, unauthorized modification, and disobeying regulations. But right now, those charges felt like a small price to pay to avoid burning to death in the turret. When he finished, Thompson secured the mirror to the wire brackets, twisting the wire tight, and tested the angle. The reflection of the area behind the tank was perfect. He slid into Crawford's seat, peered through the main gun sight, and glanced left at the mirror. He could see both simultaneously, no head movement required. It worked. Thompson cleaned up the metal shavings, wiping them away with his sleeve. The modification looked crude, nothing like factory-installed gear, but it was functional. In the clutter of the turret, ammunition, radios, fire extinguishers, a small mirror might just slip past inspection. He climbed out at 1:30 a.m., walked back to his bunk, and lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind fixed on tomorrow's battle. The 4th Armored Division was set to move out at 7 a.m. Intelligence reports confirmed Panthers in the area, elements of the 5th Panzer Army, determined to halt Patton's advance into France. Tomorrow would be a tank battle, no doubt about it. Either the mirror would work, or Thompson would die like his friends. In tank combat, there was no middle ground. You shot first, or you burned. At 6:15 a.m., the rumble of engines jolted Thompson awake. The battalion was gearing up to move out. By 7:12 a.m., his Sherman was rolling out of the maintenance area, its engine roaring, tracks clanking against the hard, uneven ground. Thompson settled into the loader's position, surrounded by 76 rounds of 75mm ammunition. Armor-piercing, high-explosive, white phosphorus. He'd loaded these shells hundreds of times before, but today might be the last. Crawford sat to his right in the gunner's seat. The tank commander stood in the cupola above them, and the driver and assistant driver manned the hull up front. 5 men trapped inside 30 tons of steel, rolling toward German positions 12 miles east. The battalion advanced in a column formation, 18 Shermans spread across 2 miles of French farmland. Fields stretched out on either side, tree lines dotted the horizon, and hills loomed to the north. Perfect terrain for an ambush, the kind of landscape where Panthers hid in wait, picking off American tanks one by one. Thompson watched Crawford out of the corner of his eye. The gunner hadn't said a word about the mirror. Either he hadn't noticed it yet, or he was choosing to ignore it. Thompson didn't blame him. Better to keep the illegal modification quiet. All that mattered was whether it would work when the bullets started flying. At 8:43 a.m., the radio crackled to life. The lead tank reported movement ahead. German armor, likely 6 Panthers, at a range of 2,000 yards, too far for accurate firing. The battalion commander ordered the column to spread out. Find hull-down positions behind ridges and embankments, and wait for the Germans to close the gap. Thompson's crew took cover behind a low ridge. The tank commander called out potential targets over the intercom, and Crawford swiveled the turret, scanning the open farmland through the narrow gun sight. No enemies were visible yet. The Germans were too smart to expose themselves, using the terrain to stay hidden until they had a clear shot. Thompson loaded an armor-piercing round, slammed the breech closed, and tapped Crawford's shoulder. Ready. His heart thundered in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. This was the moment of truth. Either the mirror would save them, or his reckless modification would be for nothing. At 9:07 a.m., Crawford fired. The gun recoiled violently, the breech popped open, and a hot brass casing clattered to the turret floor. Smoke filled the space, stinging Thompson's eyes. He grabbed another round, loaded it, and slammed the breech shut. The whole process took 6 seconds. Crawford was already swiveling the turret to the right, searching for the next target, when his voice cut through the intercom, calm and steady. "Panther, left rear, 800 yards." Thompson's stomach dropped. Left rear meant flanking. A Panther had circled around, aiming for the Sherman side armor, the weakest point in the tank's defenses. A single hit from that range would kill everyone inside instantly. But Crawford had seen it, not because the tank commander had spotted it, not because he'd swiveled the turret to search, because he'd glanced at the mirror, caught the Panther's reflection, and called it out immediately. The mirror had worked. Crawford swiveled the turret left at full speed, the mechanism whirring loudly. Thompson peered through a vision port and saw the Panther, moving across open ground, completely exposed. The German crew probably thought they were undetected, that they had time to get into position, that they'd fire first and destroy the Sherman before anyone knew they were there. They were dead wrong. Crawford fired. The round struck the Panther's left track, disabling it. The German tank ground to a halt, unable to move. The Panther's crew scrambled to swivel their own turret, trying to return fire. But Crawford was faster. He loaded another round in 7 seconds, faster than Thompson had ever seen him work, and fired again. This time, the shell pierced the Panther's turret side. The German tank shuddered, and smoke billowed out of its hatches. The crew bailed out, running for cover, leaving their burning tank behind. Thompson stared in disbelief. That Panther should have killed them. It had gotten within 800 yards undetected, should have fired first, should have torn through their side armor and turned the Sherman into a coffin of fire. But the mirror had given Crawford 3 extra seconds. 3 seconds to spot the threat, 3 seconds to swivel the turret, 3 seconds to fire first and win. The tank commander's excited voice blared over the intercom, asking how Crawford had spotted the Panther so quickly. Crawford said he'd glanced left and seen something in his peripheral vision. The commander didn't press further. He was too busy directing the crew toward the next target. The battle raged for 40 minutes. Thompson's crew destroyed 2 more Panthers, and other Shermans in the battalion took out 3 more. When the Germans finally withdrew, they left 7 burning Panthers behind. American losses were minimal. 2 Shermans damaged, none destroyed, no one killed. It was a victory that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. After the fight, the crew returned to the maintenance area. Crawford climbed out of the turret, found Thompson, and stared at him for a long, quiet moment before his eyes drifted to the mirror mounted inside the turret. He reached out, touched the metal frame, adjusted the angle slightly, and tested the reflection of the area behind the tank. Then he turned to Thompson, his voice low. "When did you install this?" Thompson told him the truth. He'd done it alone the night before. It had taken 40 minutes, and it was completely illegal. He'd risked court-martial because Martinez was dead, and he couldn't bear to watch Crawford die the same way. Crawford was silent for a moment, then said something Thompson would never forget. "This saved us today. That Panther would have killed us if I hadn't seen it. I need you to do something for me." Thompson asked what he needed. "Install one in every tank in the battalion." Thompson started with Sergeant Robert Hayes, Crawford's wingman, who'd lost his own loader 3 weeks earlier when a Panther flanked them and burned the man alive. Hayes had survived with burns on his hands, and his new loader was an 18-year-old kid from Ohio, terrified out of his mind. That evening, Thompson tracked down Hayes, showed him the mirror in Crawford's tank, and demonstrated how it worked. Hayes tested it himself, sitting in the gunner's seat and glancing between the main sight and the mirror, and immediately asked if Thompson could install one in his Sherman. "Tonight," Thompson said, "and don't tell a soul." They worked after 11 p.m., with Thompson handling the tools and Hayes keeping watch for patrolling officers. The installation took 35 minutes, faster than the first time. Now that Thompson knew the exact position and angle, knew how to drill the holes without making the bits squeal too loud. When they finished, Hayes tested it again and declared it perfect. His gunner would now be able to spot flanking threats in an instant. Hayes asked how much he owed Thompson for the work. Thompson shook his head. "Just don't get killed. That's payment enough." The next day, Hayes's crew found themselves in a fight with 4 Panthers near Moncourt. Using the mirror, Hayes's gunners spotted 2 of the flanking Panthers before they could get into firing position, taking both out with clean shots. Hayes returned to the maintenance area, raving about the modification, telling every tank commander in the company about the simple mirror that had saved his crew. By evening, 6 more crews were begging Thompson to install mirrors in their Shermans. He installed 3 that night, 2 more the night after that. Word spread through the battalion like wildfire. Loaders talked to loaders, gunners talked to gunners, and tank commanders started asking their crews if they'd heard about the mirror trick that was turning the tide of battles. Some crews were skeptical, but most were desperate enough to try anything to avoid burning to death in their turrets. By September 25th, Thompson had installed mirrors in 14 Shermans. He was exhausted, working maintenance shifts during the day and modifying tanks at night, surviving on just 4 hours of sleep a night. But he was also watching crews survive battles that would have wiped them out a week earlier. The battalion's kill ratio had flipped on its head. 5 Panthers destroyed for every Sherman lost, a stark contrast to the reversed ratio from just a month before. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the battalion, and he was a tanker's tanker. Aggressive, sharp, and intimately familiar with every detail of armor combat. He quickly noticed that something had changed. His crews were spotting German tanks faster, reacting quicker, and winning fights they had no business winning, but he couldn't figure out what the secret was. Until September 27th, when he conducted a routine inspection of the tank line, checking maintenance, ammunition loads, and equipment readiness. Abrams climbed into Thompson's Sherman, scanning the turret's interior, and his eyes locked onto the small mirror mounted to the left of the gunner's seat. He gestured at it and asked, "What's this?" Thompson's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment he'd feared since he'd drilled the first hole. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison, all the consequences he'd ignored to save his crew were about to catch up with him. But before he could answer, Crawford spoke up. "It's a modification we made, sir," he said. "Helps the gunner spot flanking threats. Saved our lives twice in the past week." Abrams asked who had authorized it. "No one, sir," Crawford replied. "We did it ourselves. Knew it was against regulations. But it works." Abrams stared at the mirror for a long, quiet minute, then climbed out of the turret and walked down the line of tanks. He climbed into Hayes's Sherman and saw another mirror. Same position, same angle. He climbed into a third tank, then a fourth, and found mirrors in every one. He realized what was happening. A dozen tanks had been modified, all in the exact same way, all without official approval. He called Thompson over, standing at attention in front of the tank, and asked him directly, "Did you install these mirrors?" "Yes, sir," Thompson said, bracing for the worst. "All of them. 14 tanks total. Takes about 40 minutes per tank. Use salvaged materials. No requisitions, no paperwork. Completely illegal." Thompson stood rigid, waiting for Abrams to order his arrest. Instead, the colonel asked a question that left him stunned. "How many tanks in this battalion don't have mirrors yet?" 23, sir," Thompson replied. Abrams looked at him, then gave an order that would change everything. "You have 48 hours to install mirrors in every tank in this battalion. That's an order. I'll handle the paperwork. You focus on keeping my crews alive." Thompson could hardly believe his ears. Abrams had just made the illegal modification official, shielding him from court-martial and turning a desperate crewman's trick into a battalion-wide standard. More than that, the colonel understood that the mirrors were saving lives, and he was willing to break regulations to save even more. That night, Thompson worked faster than ever before. He recruited other mechanics from the maintenance crew, showing them the exact position and angle for the mirrors, teaching them how to drill the holes quietly and secure the wire brackets. By September 29th, every Sherman in the battalion had a mirror mounted in its turret. The modification was no longer a secret. It was standard equipment. The Battle of Arras raged for 2 weeks, from September 19 to October 3rd, pitting the 4th Armored Division against elements of the 5th Panzer Army, 47 German Panthers and Panzer IV against the American Shermans. The Germans had better tanks, better guns, better armor. But they lost the fight. American tankers destroyed over 60 German tanks, losing just 18 Shermans in return. The kill ratio stunned German commanders who had spent months exploiting the Sherman's weaknesses. Something had shifted. American tanks were spotting flanking maneuvers before the Germans could get into position, reversing course and firing first. German after-action reports were baffled, mentioning unusual American tactics and Shermans that seemed to have eyes in the back of their heads. They weren't wrong. The eyes were 3 by 4-inch shaving mirrors mounted in turrets across the battalion. By early October, word of the modification had spread beyond the 4th Armored Division. Tank crews swapped stories during resupply runs, and mechanics shared installation tips with their counterparts from other units. A crew chief from the 6th Armored Division visited the 4th maintenance area, saw the mirrors, and asked Thompson to show him how to install them. 2 days later, the 6th Armored began fitting mirrors to their Shermans. Then the 10th Armored Division heard about it, followed by the 3rd Armored. The modification spread battalion to battalion, division to division. No official orders, no engineering directives, just soldiers helping soldiers survive. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams wrote a report to 3rd Army headquarters, detailing the mirror modification and including the staggering combat statistics. Before the mirrors, the 4th Armored lost 2 Shermans for every German tank destroyed. After the mirrors, they destroyed 3 German tanks for every Sherman lost. The difference was undeniable. The mirrors had given American gunners a tactical edge that offset the Germans' superiority in hardware. General George Patton read the report, and he immediately understood its significance. Patton knew that tank battles were won by whoever shot first, and those extra seconds from the mirror could mean the difference between victory and defeat. He issued a direct order. The mirror modification was to be installed in every Sherman in the 3rd Army. No suggestions, no requests, a command. Maintenance crews across the 3rd Army went to work, scavenging materials wherever they could find them. Salvaged metal, wire, even glass from broken windows. The mirrors didn't need to be fancy. They just needed to reflect. By October 15th, over 300 Shermans in Europe had mirrors mounted in their turrets. What had started as one loader's desperate gamble had become an Army-wide tactical advantage, all in less than a month. In November 1944, an engineering team from the Ordnance Department arrived at 4th Armored Division headquarters. 3 officers and 2 civilian engineers sent to evaluate the mirror modification and determine if it should be integrated into standard Sherman production. For 3 days, they inspected tanks, interviewed crews, and tested the mirrors in combat simulations, measuring angles, calculating sight lines, and verifying that the modification didn't interfere with turret operations. Their conclusion was unanimous. The mirrors worked, and they should have been part of the Sherman's original design. The Ordnance Department recommended that all new Shermans rolling off production lines be fitted with mirrors in the gunner's position, and that existing tanks in the field be retrofitted during maintenance cycles. The modification would become official, standard-issue equipment, no longer an illegal field hack. But there was a catch. The engineers wanted to redesign the installation, making it cleaner and more professional, using manufactured brackets instead of bent wire and regulation mirrors instead of shaving kits. They also wanted credit, writing reports, filing patents, and claiming the mirror system as an Ordnance Department innovation. Thompson's name appeared nowhere in their documentation. Neither did Crawford's, neither did Hayes's. The official record would state that Army engineers had identified a flaw in the Sherman sighting system and developed a solution. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams fought to correct this, writing letters and submitting reports that highlighted Thompson's role, but his efforts were buried in military bureaucracy. The engineer's version became the official story. Thompson learned about this in December when an officer showed him the official documentation and asked if he wanted to file a complaint. He said no. He didn't care about credit or recognition. He cared that loaders weren't burning alive anymore, that crews were coming home to their families. If the Army wanted to pretend the engineers had invented the mirrors, that was fine, as long as the mirrors stayed in the tanks. By January 1945, the mirror modification was standard across all American armor units in Europe, with over 800 Shermans fitted with the device. U.S. production lines began including mirrors in new tanks, turning a field improvisation into a factory-installed feature. Thompson continued loading for Crawford, fighting through the Battle of the Bulge and pushing into Germany, surviving engagements that would have killed them 6 months earlier. The mirror saved their lives 4 more times. Each time Crawford spotted a flanking Panther in the reflection, fired first, and kept the crew alive. Other crews had similar stories. Loaders who would have died in December were still fighting in February, still coming home to their loved ones. The mirrors had become so commonplace that new crews thought they were part of the Sherman's original design, never realizing they had started as an illegal modification. Only the older crews knew the truth. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Thompson's crew was in Czechoslovakia when Germany surrendered, having fought for 11 months and survived dozens of engagements. The mirror had saved them 8 times in total. 8 times Crawford had spotted a flanking Panther. 8 times they'd fired first. 8 times Thompson had kept loading instead of burning. Crawford survived the war, logging 63 combat engagements and 14 confirmed tank kills. He returned to Detroit in August 1945, went back to factory work, got married, and had 3 kids. For 40 years, he kept a photograph of his Sherman crew on his desk. A young, thin, grease-covered Frank Thompson standing next to the tank. Every year on September 19th, Crawford called Thompson to thank him for installing the mirror, saying he never would have survived the war without it. Thompson always brushed it off, saying he was just doing his job as a loader, keeping his crew alive. Thompson stayed in the Army until 1946, then returned to his small hometown outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He worked in a steel mill for 32 years, the same job he'd had before the war, pouring hot metal, operating heavy machinery, and working long shifts. He married in 1948, had 2 daughters, and lived a quiet, unassuming life. He never talked about the mirror. When people asked about his war service, he said he'd been a loader on a tank crew and left it at that. No mention of the modification, no mention of saving hundreds of lives, no mention of changing how American tanks fought in Europe. It wasn't modesty. He just didn't think it mattered anymore. Hayes survived the war too, never losing another crew member thanks to the mirror. After the war, he became a high school history teacher in Ohio, and sometimes he'd tell his students about tank combat, about how small, desperate innovations could save lives. He never mentioned Thompson by name. He didn't know if Thompson wanted the attention. By the 1960s, the mirror modification had been all but forgotten. New tanks had better optics and sighting systems, and the Sherman was retired to museums. Veterans looked at the old tanks and remembered the war, but few remembered the crude mirrors that had once saved their lives. Thompson's contribution had been erased from the official record, not intentionally, but through the slow grind of bureaucracy. Field modifications weren't considered historically significant. Official engineering developments were. Thompson retired from the steel mill in 1978 and spent his golden years tinkering in his garage, fixing cars and small engines, the same work he'd done on tanks during the war. His daughters knew he'd served in the Army, knew he'd been a tank crewman, but they knew nothing about the mirrors. That changed in 1992, when a military historian researching Sherman tank modifications stumbled upon references to improvised mirror sighting systems in 4th Armored Division maintenance logs, along with a passing mention of Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson. The historian spent 6 months tracking down veterans from the unit, eventually finding Crawford, who told him the full story. Martinez's death, Thompson's illegal mirror installation, the way the modification had spread across the battalion, and the hundreds of lives it had saved. The historian tracked Thompson down through veteran registries. 74 years old, still living in Pennsylvania, still working part-time in his garage. When the historian asked if he'd installed the mirrors, Thompson said yes. When the historian asked why he cared about a story that had happened 50 years ago, he replied that he'd found maintenance logs from over 40 battalions, estimating that the mirrors had saved between 200 and 300 American tank crew lives between September 1944 and May 1945. Thompson just nodded, saying he'd never counted. He just remembered the men who'd come home. That was enough for him. The historian published his findings in 1994. A small article in a military history journal that credited Thompson included interviews with Crawford and Hayes and detailed the mirror's impact on the war. The article reached only about 2,000 readers, academics, veterans, and history buffs, but it was enough to bring Thompson 3 letters, One from a former tank commander who said the mirror had saved his crew twice, one from a loader who'd learned the installation technique from Thompson's crew chief, and one from a veteran who'd left everything in Europe except his duffel bag and discharge papers. Crawford visited Thompson in 1996, driving all the way from Detroit to Pennsylvania. They hadn't seen each other in 40 years, but they talked for 6 straight hours about the war, about the mirror, about the friends they'd lost and the friends they'd saved. Crawford told Thompson he'd spent years writing letters to the Army and veterans organizations, trying to get him recognized, but no one had cared. Too much time had passed. Too many bigger war stories had overshadowed the small, brave act of a single loader. Thompson just shook his head, saying he didn't need recognition. He had Crawford sitting in his garage, alive and well. That was recognition enough. Frank Thompson died on March 14, 2003, at the age of 84, from heart failure. His local newspaper obituary mentioned his service in World War II as a tank crewman with the 4th Armored Division, but it said nothing about the mirror modification, nothing about saving hundreds of lives, nothing about changing the course of armor combat in Europe. His funeral was small, attended only by family and a few friends, until 3 strangers showed up. They introduced themselves as tank veterans, men whose crews had used the mirror modification, who'd read about Thompson's death in a veteran's newsletter. They wanted to pay their respects, to tell Thompson's family what he'd done. It was on that day that Thompson's daughters learned the full story, how their father had risked court-martial to install a mirror in a tank turret, how that mirror had spread across an army, how it had saved hundreds of lives, how he'd never spoken of it because he didn't think it mattered. Today, Thompson's story exists only in fragments. Maintenance logs tucked away in the National Archives, interview transcripts in military history collections, a single paragraph in a book about Sherman tank modifications. Most people who study World War II armor have never heard his name. The mirror modification is a footnote, a curiosity, not important enough for textbooks. But if you visit the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, you can see a Sherman tank from the 4th Armored Division on display. Inside its turret, mounted 12 inches to the left of the gunner's seat, is a small rectangular mirror, 3 by 4 inches, metal frame, held in place by crude wire brackets. It's labeled as a field modification, common in late 1944. No name is attached. That mirror is Frank Thompson's legacy, not the official one, written by engineers and bureaucrats. The real one, the one that mattered to Crawford, to Hayes, to the 200 men who came home because a desperate loader broke the rules to save his crew. That's how innovation really happens in war. Not through committees or engineering teams, but through soldiers who see a problem and fix it, who don't wait for authorization, who risk everything because their friends are dying and they can't stand watching anymore. Thompson installed the mirror to save one man, and that mirror saved hundreds. Nobody remembers his name, but you do now. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit the like button. Every like helps us rescue more forgotten stories from the archives and share them with people who care. Subscribe to join our community of history keepers. These stories don't preserve themselves. They need people like you, who understand that the real heroes weren't always the ones with medals. Sometimes they were loaders with mirrors and the courage to break the rules. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our audience stretches from Texas to Berlin, from tank museum volunteers to the grandchildren of Sherman crewmen. You're not just watching, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for making sure Frank Thompson's story doesn't fade into silence.